Hurry, open the vent! I am trying.
What if I told you that the warmest place in a medieval castle was also the most deadly? Imagine a huge room, thick with soot, where the temperature was constantly as hot as summer, and the risk of sudden disaster lurked around every corner, literally hanging in the air. Paradoxically, this room was the heart of the entire castle community. But for those who worked there, it was not just a kitchen, but rather a red-hot crucible of survival that required constant attention and tremendous physical endurance. Here, amid clouds of smoke and roaring flames, daily work turned into a constant struggle against the elements, where burns, falls, and suffocating smoke were constant companions in the lives of cooks and their assistants. Watch the video to the end, and you will learn the true price, expressed in sweat, accidents, and enormous risk, of maintaining the luxurious table of a medieval lord. I discovered this by accident while studying the blueprints of old fortresses, and I want to share it with you. It is important to understand that in most medieval castles, kitchens were not located inside the main residential keep, as one might expect, but in a separate building or in a distant wing, which was not a whim, but a harsh and pragmatic necessity to ensure the safety of the entire structure. This architectural solution, which seemed inconvenient due to the need to constantly carry ready-made dishes over long distances, was in fact the castle's first line of defense against its main internal enemy, uninvited fire. The detached kitchen, often a massive stone tower or annex, was designed as a kind of fire insulator, so that in the event of a fire, the flames would not spread to the wooden floors and valuable supplies in the main part of the fortress. The boilers and hearths in these rooms were so huge that their heat could quickly heat the stone walls to a high temperature, creating an unbearable microclimate inside, which seemed to be designed not for cooking, but for testing human endurance. The constantly high temperature, maintained by numerous open hearths and braziers, was intended for cooking food for hundreds of people, including the garrison, servants, and the Lord's court. And this process required constant attention to the amount of hot fuel. The thick stone walls of the kitchen did not have enough windows to provide adequate ventilation, which exacerbated the heat problem and led to the accumulation of acrid, thick smoke that slowly rose to the ceiling. This particular layout, which made the kitchen space incredibly warm even in the harshest winter frosts, also turned it into an area with a high concentration of vapors and odors that literally ate into the clothes and skin of the people working there.
Hurry, open the vent!
Massive stone hearths were located directly on the floor or on low platforms, and working with them required constant bending or standing in uncomfortable positions, which combined with the heat quickly led to physical exhaustion. The size and volume of kitchen utensils, from huge knives and axes to giant ladles and spoons, were adapted for mass cooking, but required considerable physical strength and skill from the cooks to avoid accidental injuries. In this special architecture, where the priority was the protection of the castle rather than the comfort of the staff, every day was a test of endurance for those who stood by the hot fire, providing food for all the other inhabitants of the fortress. We are very interested in hearing your point of view. What do you think about this logic of castle design, where safety was prioritized over the comfort of workers? Share your opinion in the comments and be sure to subscribe to our channel so you don't miss the next episodes. Want to know the main secret of how smoke could be deadly, even though it didn't cause a direct fire? Medieval kitchens were real testing grounds for any ideas about ventilation, or rather, for its almost complete absence in early buildings. These rooms existed not as convenient places for cooking, but as huge smokehouses where every breath was a challenge. The smoke from smoldering logs and open fires, necessary for roasting meat, baking bread, cooking soups, and simultaneously preparing dozens of dishes, had neither an organized exit route nor sufficient draft. It slowly rose, thickened under the ceiling, and then slid down like a heavy gray-black curtain, gradually filling the entire space from the beams to the floor. This mixture of smoke, greasy soot, and coal dust not only impaired visibility, It made being in the kitchen painful even for experienced people. The mucous membranes dried out after just a few minutes, the eyes watered endlessly, and the throat began to sting as if it had been burned by hot steam. The constant irritation of the respiratory tract caused coughing fits that were difficult to control, making the work not only difficult but also dangerous. A cook who lost his bearings or choked on a dry cough could easily burn himself, drop a heavy cauldron, or knock over a pot of boiling fat. Unlike modern fireplaces with carefully designed chimneys, early medieval hearths were often just a depression in the floor and a hole in the roof through which the smoke had to somehow escape outside. Sometimes a primitive stone cap was placed over the hearth, but it only partially retained the products of combustion. Most of the smoke remained in the room and continued to circulate, settling on everything in its path. The air became particularly heavy when fatty meat was fried. Hot vapors and drops of melted fat, exploding on the coals, raised clouds of suffocating smoke, almost opaque and sticky. Kitchen workers were forced to spend long hours in this atmosphere, often without the opportunity to go outside for fresh air. Constant inhalation of the toxic mixture caused chronic coughing, headaches, and general depression, and sometimes led to more serious illnesses. The kitchen became a place of constant struggle, not only with fire, but also with one's own body. It was almost impossible to maintain a minimum level of cleanliness. Even the water in large vats quickly became cloudy, saturated with soot particles, and the workers' clothes became almost coal black in a matter of weeks, regardless of their original color. The situation became particularly dangerous when the hearths were placed dangerously close to wooden partitions, beams, or places where dried herbs and grain were stored. Smoke saturated with microscopic particles of smoldering coal could creep into the smallest cracks and lead to hidden smoldering and ignition in places where no one had looked for weeks. Thus, even in the absence of an open flame, the kitchen was a source of constant hidden danger. The danger of suffocation, poisoning, and sudden fire. What element of medieval architecture, apart from the chimney, do you think could have radically improved working conditions in the kitchen? What you are about to learn will change your perception of how fire was maintained in the Middle Ages. Fire in a medieval castle kitchen was not just a short-lived phenomenon, but a huge, constantly operating system that required vigilant control over millions of pieces of hot coals and tons of hot ashes, which in itself posed a constant and acute danger. These smoldering coals, removed from the main hearths after they had served their initial purpose, were not discarded but transferred to various braziers, ovens, and portable fireplaces for slow cooking or reheating of food, which required constant and careful handling. Even after the coals appeared to have gone out and turned to ash, they could retain enough heat for many hours to cause serious burns if accidentally touched, so the floor around the hearths was an area of constant thermal risk. Fuel storage was also a problem. Huge stocks of dry wood and coal were often kept right in the kitchen or in an adjoining room, and a single spark accidentally dropped from a portable bucket could lead to an instant and uncontrollable fire. During the lengthy cooking process, the temperature of the coals had to be maintained at a certain level, and workers constantly fanned them with bellows or even just their breath, exposing their faces to heat and sparks. Don't you think that this constant work with hot materials was the most difficult part of a cook's job? But even the most cunning trail is useless if your pursuers have water. In the next chapter, you will learn how the Apaches turned the main source of life in the desert into a deadly weapon. Ready to learn more? In medieval kitchens, water, which was essential for cooking and extinguishing fires, was in dangerous and constant proximity to huge and almost uncontrollable sources of heat. This close proximity was not a matter of choice, but of necessity, as the kitchen was the heart of any castle or large house, where huge amounts of food were prepared every day. But it was this forced proximity that made the room a real arena of hidden struggle between the elements, which could get out of control at any moment. Boiling liquids collided with open flames, and stone floor tiles, heated by long hours of work, reacted violently to any contact with moisture. creating unique threats that were found nowhere else. Every step a kitchen worker took became part of a complex and risky choreography, where it was necessary to remember that one wrong move could result in serious injury or even death. The presence of huge pots filled with boiling broth, water for cooking vegetables, or heated liquid for washing dishes in close proximity to open fires creates a feeling of constant tension even for a modern observer. These cauldrons were not light and convenient, but were heavy vessels that sometimes weighed dozens of kilograms even when empty. When filled with boiling liquid, any tilt or turn could be disastrous. Accidental tipping or even a small splash of boiling water on hot stones instantly led to the formation of a thick cloud of scalding steam, which got out of control in the first few seconds. Such steam could engulf a significant part of the kitchen, obscure nearby objects, and prevent workers from understanding where the fire was, where people were, and where it was safe. Thick clouds of steam rose from the boiling pots and gradually settled in the room, creating a heavy, humid atmosphere. Combined with the heat from the fire, this turned the kitchen into a kind of sauna where people had to work without rest for long hours. This climate caused rapid dehydration and heat exhaustion, which even the strongest workers suffered from. In the summer, the heat became so intense that many lost consciousness right at their workplaces, and their colleagues were forced to take them out into the fresh air. Working with a boiling cauldron required the cook's constant attention. When he bent down to taste the dish or add ingredients, his face and hands were in close proximity to the rising steam. People protected themselves as best they could, using thick gloves, handy towels, or long wooden spoons. But even these measures did not always save them, and burns to the hands and forearms were part of the profession. Even opening the wooden lid of a huge cauldron was a dangerous moment. When the lid was lifted, a powerful stream of steam burst out, which could momentarily completely obscure the view, take one's breath away, and disorient a person. In a kitchen environment where literally every object could cause injury, losing one's bearings was unacceptable. So workers learned to step back or turn away in a split second. Water in large containers also served as a reserve for extinguishing sparks or small fires, which regularly occurred in the kitchen due to unstable heat sources and dry wooden surfaces. These containers had to be kept ready at all times, but at the same time not interfere with the movement of workers, which made their placement a thoughtful task that required experience and knowledge of the usual chaos of the kitchen. Thus, water, which under normal conditions was a source of life, a salvation from thirst and an essential ingredient in food, became a dangerous tool in the medieval kitchen, which, if mishandled, could cause serious burns or even death. It became something like a two-handed sword that could help, but always carried a threat. In general, the interaction of water and fire in medieval cuisine was like a constant, dangerous dance on the edge, where every drop that fell in the wrong place could result in an accident, a burn, or serious injury. It was a world where the elements lived alongside humans, helping them, but never forgiving carelessness. What if I told you that medieval cooks were some of the strongest people in the castle, even though they weren't warriors? Working in a medieval castle kitchen required not only culinary talent, but also incredible physical strength and endurance, as almost all operations involved in preparing food for large numbers of people were done by hand and with extremely heavy objects. The cauldrons in which the dishes were prepared could weigh dozens of kilograms even when empty, and after being filled with water, meat, and vegetables, their weight became so significant that it took the strength of 2 or even 3 strong assistants to move them or remove them from the fire. Lifting such a heavy red-hot vessel from the fire with chains and hooks, often accompanied by sudden movements and the risk of slipping on the greasy floor, was probably the most dangerous operation in the kitchen. Processing huge carcasses of meat, which had to be chopped, cut up, and carried to the hearth, also required the use of heavy, massive axes and knives, as well as considerable muscle power to use them accurately and safely. Kneading large quantities of dough for bread or pies, which formed the basis of the diet, was done in wooden troughs and required long hours of rhythmic and heavy physical labor, which quickly exhausted one's strength. Firewood and coal, which were used to fuel the continuously burning hearths, were delivered to the kitchen in huge quantities every day, and their transportation and storage were the responsibility of the youngest and strongest assistants. Long, heavy metal rods were used to turn and move large pieces of meat roasting on skewers over an open fire, and the slightest loosening of the grip could cause a red-hot piece to fall to the floor or into the fire. Stone millstones for grinding grain or spices, if located in the kitchen itself, were operated manually, and this task was one of the most monotonous and exhausting, requiring constant exertion. Even stirring the contents of huge cauldrons with massive wooden paddles and spatulas required the use of all the muscles of the torso and arms, and the hot steam and heat from the fire further increased fatigue. Constant tension and fatigue at the end of a long working day became the main cause of carelessness and accidental mistakes, when a weakened person could lift a load incorrectly or slip. Thus, every day in a medieval kitchen was a kind of survival training, where the combination of high temperatures and the need to constantly work with heavy weights quickly led to complete physical exhaustion. Which part of the job do you think was the most tiring? Carrying coals or stirring huge cauldrons? In the next chapter, we'll talk about their unique system of logistics and survival. You've definitely never heard of this unique secret. Medieval castle kitchens often amaze travelers and scribes with their colossal architecture. The vaults rose so high that they seemed to be part of another floor, hidden in darkness and smoke. These majestic heights were not created for beauty or to demonstrate wealth. They served a harsh necessity: to give hot smoke, steam, vapors from boiling cauldrons, and the smells of roasting meat space to rise upward, away from people, to at least slightly delay the moment when this heavy mixture would descend. This gigantic vertical structure, used as a primitive but vital means of ventilation, was created for pragmatic reasons, but inevitably entailed unique dangers unknown to the modest kitchens of ordinary rural homes. Where the ceiling was literally a few meters above the hearth, there was only one risk: burns or suffocating smoke. But in the castle kitchen, where the arches could reach a height of 3 or 4 human heights, there was a completely different category of threats. Those associated with working in vertical space, with height, with falling, with the inconvenience of movement. Working with huge ovens and massive boilers required not just dexterity, but truly circus-like precision. Huge metal or clay vessels suspended over an open fire could not be removed by hand. Instead, poles several meters long, hooks and long levers were used. They had to be manipulated blindly through clouds of hot smoke that obscured the eyes and burned the respiratory tract. In such a situation, even an experienced cook could make a mistake, touch the edge of the cauldron, or rock the suspension system so that the boiling contents tilted rapidly. If it was necessary to stir a stew or porridge in a cauldron whose diameter exceeded a person's height, the cook had to climb onto a stool, wooden box, or narrow platform. These improvised platforms were rarely stable. Even a slight tilt of the body was enough to lose balance and fall down, straight into the fire or onto the stone slab. The high stone walls of the kitchen were equipped with numerous shelves, deep niches, and hanging hooks for storing ingredients, spices, dried herbs, and rarely used utensils. All of this had to be retrieved daily, and each time the risk of falling was enormous. The ladders were slippery, and the steps were often uneven or damaged due to constant dampness and soot. Sometimes narrow wooden galleries or mezzanines were built above the main cooking area to house storage, assistants, or supervisors of the cooking process for large feasts. These galleries were made of simple planks reinforced with beams, often without railings or fences. Falling from such a height onto a stone floor could be fatal, and such cases were mentioned in the chronicles. The upper levels of the kitchen had almost no lighting. The light from torches and candles was lost in the thick, smoky darkness, and the few openings in the walls were quickly clogged with a layer of soot. Workers perceived the upper part of the kitchen as a separate level of darkness, where it was better not to go unless absolutely necessary. Mistakes in judging distances, stair steps, and the location of beams were commonplace. Shadows and smoke distorted everything around them. Thus, the majestic volume of the kitchen space, originally created as a way to combat suffocating smoke, simultaneously brought a whole new set of threats to the daily lives of workers. Height became an invisible enemy, silent, constant, and utterly merciless. Did you like how dangerous height can be? Then don't forget to like this video if you think medieval cooks deserve a monument for their incredible endurance. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any new videos. The medieval kitchen, like a permanent production workshop operating over an open fire and with huge amounts of fat, was a place where soot and greasy soot were not temporary contaminants, but were a permanent, ineradicable part of the interior, creating an additional hazard. A layer of grease mixed with fine coal dust and ash covered not only the walls and ceiling, but also all work surfaces and, most importantly, the uneven stone or earthen floor, making it constantly and treacherously slippery. This greasy coating on the floor was especially dangerous near the furnaces, where workers had to move quickly with hot or heavy objects in their hands, and the slightest inattention could lead to a fatal slip. The walls, covered with a thick, black layer of soot, not only absorbed the already scarce light, but also served as an ideal place for the accumulation of fat deposits, which over time became highly combustible. Work tools, including the handles of frying pans, ladles, and knives, were also covered with a sticky layer of grease, which made it difficult to grip them securely and increased the risk of them slipping out of the hands, especially if they were wet with sweat or water. Attempts to clean the floor often consisted of simply covering it with a fresh layer of straw or sand, which absorbed the grease for a short time but quickly became unusable and itself became part of the flammable debris. The presence of this constant slippery covering made it almost impossible to move quickly and confidently. Every step had to be careful and measured, which slowed down the work but prevented falls. Food scraps, spilled liquids, and bits of food constantly accumulated underfoot, mixing with grease and ash to create a very dangerous, uneven, and slippery surface on which to walk in heavy shoes. The lack of adequate lighting in corners and under extractor hoods made it impossible to see the most slippery areas of the floor, so workers relied more on muscle memory and the feel of their feet than on their eyesight. Because of this ubiquitous soot and grease, workers were constantly getting dirty, and their clothes, saturated with these substances, not only smelled bad, but also became more flammable, attracting sparks flying from the fire. Cleaning the walls and ceilings of this greasy soot was such a laborious and rare task that most kitchens were permanently black, and this black color was a direct indicator of their constant and intense work. Thus, the sticky and slippery floor, saturated with the products of combustion and cooking, was not just an inconvenience, but a constant trap that turned ordinary movement into a high-risk zone. The main and most catastrophic threat in a medieval castle kitchen, a threat that outweighed all others and instilled constant fear even in experienced cooks, was undoubtedly the risk of an uncontrolled fire. It was an enemy that could flare up suddenly without warning and destroy not only the kitchen, but the entire castle, its people, property, supplies, and the very existence of the fortified house. This danger was so obvious and constant that castle architects preferred to place the kitchen not inside the main building, but at a distance, often in a separate stone wing, or even in a separate building connected to the main building only by a covered passageway. This arrangement was a necessary compromise between the convenience of serving food and preventing the castle from burning down completely. The combination of a huge number of open fires, massive hearths that had to burn for 12 or more hours a day, endless streams of smoke, piles of wooden utensils, greasy dishes, straw for kindling, and heavy greasy fabrics created ideal conditions for a sudden fire. Added to this was an imperfect smoke extraction system. Chimneys became clogged with soot, cracked due to temperature changes, sometimes even crumbled inside, and hot air could not escape quickly enough. All this together turned the kitchen into a space where fire was not just a tool for cooking, but an active and unpredictable force that could get out of control. The stone walls and arches of the kitchen served as the first line of defense, designed to contain the fire within the room, but even they could not always provide complete protection. When the flames reached the wooden floors, joists, roofs, and decking, where dry materials had accumulated, they spread at a terrifying speed. It took only a few minutes for a small flame to turn into a firestorm that engulfed everything around it. Wood that had been drying for years became the perfect fuel, and grease that had accumulated in crevices and cracks acted as an accelerant. The huge stores of firewood stacked in the corners of the kitchen or in special utility rooms were essentially a giant fuel depot. They were necessary. Without a large amount of dry wood, it was impossible to maintain a stable fire in several hearths at the same time. But this necessity turned the kitchen into one of the most dangerous places in the castle. The slightest spark flying from a blazing hearth could land on a pile of firewood and cause an instant blaze that spread so quickly that the workers had no chance of stopping it. Thick layers of greasy soot and carbon deposits that had accumulated over the years on the walls, ceilings, exhaust hoods, and chimneys posed another hidden threat. These layers acted as a kind of wick. All it took was a rise in temperature or an accidental spark for the soot to burst into flames suddenly, almost explosively. A fire inside the chimney was particularly dangerous because it spread upward along the entire height of the shaft and could break out onto the roof, setting fire to beams and tiles. Next to the kitchen were often storerooms where dried herbs, grain, flour, cereals, smoked meat, and other dry foods that burn well were stored. The flames could reach these supplies through ventilation ducts, cracks in the walls, or simply through open doors. It took only a few minutes for a storeroom full of flour and straw to turn into a veritable fuel chamber. Flour was especially dangerous. Its fine dust could ignite almost like gunpowder at a certain concentration. In the event of a fire, thick smoke instantly filled the entire space. It was so dense and acrid that people lost their ability to see in a matter of moments. The smoke burned their eyes, made their throats tickle, and every attempt to breathe was accompanied by pain. In such an atmosphere, it was impossible to find your way around, and finding the door was almost a miracle. Extinguishing the fire became extremely difficult, if not pointless. People could not approach the source of the fire without risking suffocation or losing consciousness. Firefighting equipment in medieval kitchens was primitive and limited. The main tools were buckets of water, barrels of sand, and wet rags, which were used to try to beat down the flames. But in conditions where the fire spread in a matter of seconds, this was clearly not enough. A few buckets of water could not stop a fire that had engulfed the woodwork or wooden ceiling. The kitchen staff could only gain a minute or two, but they had no way of actually suppressing a strong fire. If the kitchen had wooden beams supporting the roof, the situation became even more dangerous. When the fire reached these beams, they burst into flames at an alarming rate. The flames spread along them like dry branches, turning the kitchen and adjacent rooms into a giant torch. It was almost impossible to extinguish such a fire. The wooden structures burned fiercely, and the entire castle was in danger of destruction. The main goal of the workers when a fire broke out was not to extinguish the fire. They understood perfectly well that there was almost no chance of that, but to save their lives and, if possible, the most valuable items: cauldrons, knives, and expensive utensils. People grabbed whatever they could carry at random and ran outside, trying to warn others of the danger. Meanwhile, the flames engulfed the room, destroying years of accumulated inventory. A particularly insidious factor was that fires often started at night. After work was finished, the hearths were not always completely extinguished. The coals could smolder for hours, and if they came into contact with wooden utensils, straw for kindling, or dry fabrics, a slight movement of air was enough to cause smoldering and then open flames. Such fires were often discovered too late, when the fire had already gained strength. Thus, despite all efforts, precautions, and knowledge of their work, medieval kitchens always remained a powder keg, where continuous work with fire balanced on the brink of a great catastrophe. It was a place where people faced the elements every day, knowing that even a small mistake could turn into a tragedy for the whole castle. The tools of the medieval castle kitchen were entirely suited to mass food production, which meant that most of the implements were not only large but also heavy, clumsy, and often very sharp, making them a source of numerous accidents and minor injuries. Huge knives, axes, and cleavers designed for cutting up large carcasses and chopping bones required not only great strength, but also constant concentration. The slightest mistake in movement, caused by fatigue or a slippery handle, could lead to a loss of control over a razor-sharp blade. These tools were stored in open areas or hung on walls, and the accidental fall of a heavy object caused by vibration or improper storage pose a serious threat. The massive cast iron pans and copper basins used for frying and boiling were so heavy that lifting and moving them, even when empty, required considerable effort. And when filled with hot fat or water, they became extremely dangerous to handle. Long metal spits for roasting, which could reach several meters in length, had to be rotated manually over an open fire for long hours, and their hot tips were a constant danger to those nearby. The giant pestles and mortars used to grind spices and herbs in large quantities were so cumbersome that working with them often led to strains and bruises due to improper weight distribution. Ladles and skimmers with very long wooden handles were necessary for removing food from deep cauldrons, but their clumsy size and protruding parts created a risk of hitting a neighbor or accidentally knocking over another dish standing nearby. Many tools had sharp corners or nicks from manufacturing or long-term use, and even simple careless handling could cause abrasions and cuts, which were common in the kitchen. Special hooks and chains used to hang pots over the fire were often poorly secured or worn, and the sudden fall of a heavy pot with boiling contents was one of the most frightening and rare kitchen disasters. Even a simple device such as wooden trivets for hot pots, which should have been sturdy and stable, were often made of unevenly cut wood, which could lead to unstable positioning of the cookware. In conditions of haste and poor lighting, workers often placed tools on the floor or in awkward places, creating traps for feet and hands that led to trips and falls. Thus, tools designed for efficiency in unskilled or tired hands became major sources of daily injuries and hazards. The life of a kitchen worker in a medieval castle was not just a job, but a constant, exhausting marathon in inhuman conditions, where high temperatures and physical risks took a chronic toll on the body, turning daily survival into a difficult feat. The working day began long before dawn and ended late at night, as it was necessary to prepare breakfast for all the inhabitants of the castle and then constantly be ready to prepare lunch, dinner, and light snacks, which left no time for proper rest. This constant exposure to intense heat and thick smoke led to chronic overheating, rapid dehydration, and constant strain on all bodily systems, which quickly exhausted even the strongest person. The worker's skin was constantly exposed to heat, steam, and flying sparks, which led to roughness and a constant feeling of dryness and tightness, as well as chronic skin problems caused by dirt and soot. Constantly carrying heavy loads and working in awkward positions caused chronic back, joint, and muscle pain, and these problems accumulated over the years, making work increasingly difficult and painful. His eyes suffered from constant irritation from smoke and soot, leading to watery eyes and impaired vision, which in turn increased the risk of accidents in the dimly lit kitchen. Accidental burns from touching hot surfaces or spilled boiling water were so commonplace that workers paid little attention to them until they became truly serious. Despite all the risks, working in the kitchen, especially during the cold season, offered the unique advantage of constant warmth. And for many, this was a reason to hold on to their jobs despite all the dangers. Kitchen staff were responsible not only for cooking, but also for keeping the equipment clean, washing huge pots and scrubbing floors, which required additional hours of physically demanding work after the main cooking was finished. Their endurance and ability to function under constant stress, heat, and fatigue were remarkable, and they were living proof of how strong human adaptation to adverse conditions can be. At the end of the day, the kitchen worker would leave his hot, dirty world for the relatively cool and clean castle, bearing the mark of his labor, the smell of smoke, grease, and fatigue. Thus, the high price of a warm place in the kitchen was expressed not only in the constant risk, but also in the long-term, chronic wear and tear on the human body. We see that the medieval castle kitchen was a place of striking contrast. It was the source of life for the entire castle, but at the same time, it was a source of constant danger and inhuman labor for those who worked there. The paradoxical architecture, the need to work with enormous amounts of fire and water, the constant threat of slippery floors and clumsy tools, all this turned the profession of cook and his assistants into a daily struggle for survival. They were not just cooks, they were masters of survival in conditions of extreme temperatures and constant risk, and every dinner served at the Lord's table was paid for with their incredible fortitude and sweat. Their story is not just a tale of food, but a tribute to those who found the strength and ingenuity to cope with the harshest conditions of the era. Which of the problems of medieval cuisine discussed here, smoke, heat, slippery floors, or heavy tools, do you think was most critical for survival? Share your opinion in the comments and be sure to subscribe to our channel so you don't miss out on new research into historical mysteries.